this is 43 Carroll Street you're all going to be at. That all your colleagues were Camden Society. Could you do the slot after?
The library was in Camden, near Kentish Town. DDIE.
Yeah.
Labour and Greens. So
right.
You might have swayed my decision.
Good, very good.
Thanks a lot for having a few minutes to talk to us today. We are from UCL, and we also live in your constituency. UCL's in your constituency, so we'd really like to hear what you have to say about policies affecting the local area. Just what are some of the main things, ideas for bettering the area?
Well, I think since you're all students, I'll start with the fact that there's 21% of the voters in this constituency are students, and of course we believe in zero university tuition fees. Our manifesto allows for abolishing undergraduate tuition fees. It allows for paying off student loan company loans, and it also allows for student grants. Because the fact is, what we've got at the moment is students, on average now, are leaving university with £44,000 worth of debt. 73% of them will never pay that debt off, and yet they face going through 30 years of their life with that weight of debt, meaning any time you're earning any sort of money at all, 9% of your income goes to a debt you're never going to pay off. And it simply isn't working even in its own terms. The government's figures show 48 pence in the pound isn't going to be paid off. So this is actually not a way of funding universities. So that if we go away from the sort of particularly student issues, we have a huge problem in Camden, as in the rest of the country, with low pay. So many people in London are trying to survive on a national minimum wage of £6.50 an hour, when calculated in London as £9.15 is a minimum living decent kind of wage. So we want to make the minimum wage a living wage, saying if you work full time, you should earn enough money to live on. And of course, one of the other big issues in Camden is housing, and the fact that so many people are just struggling to rent even a room in a shared house. The average person in London is paying more than 50% of their income on rent. So what we want to do is really change the whole housing situation around, so that we start to think about houses as stable, secure, affordable places to live, not as financial assets. And to do that, what we want to do is remove mortgage rate relief from private landlords and use the money from that to build 500,000 homes for social rent over the course of this Parliament. We want to end right to buy, so we stop the privatisation of that public asset, the housing stock. And also we want to put a cap on rises in private rents, so that you should, as a private renter, have up to 5 years security of tenure if you want it, and your rent in that time can't go up by more than the rate of inflation. And it's really just starting to rebalance the whole thing. So those are some of the sort of big issues that impact on Camden. The other one that I'd add that's particularly local is HS2, the proposed high-speed 2 rail line. The Green Party is opposed to that nationally, as well as here in Camden. I've pledged very clearly, without any difficulty at all, that I would vote against HS2 in Parliament as the MP for Hobarton and Pancras. And that's based on not just the damage, which is extensive, that it would do to Camden, but the fact that this is ill-planned. It was basically drawn up on the back of the envelope by the last Labor government. And what we need to do is plan sensibly for our transport policy, not just start with this idea that's sketched out and then just takes on a whole life of its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where was that planning on going, the railway through Camden?
Right, well, I mean, the impact is particularly strong in Regent's Park, where we lose hundreds of homes, because at the moment it's planned to go into Euston Station. It would have huge impacts on all of the Indian restaurants there, which of course have been there for decades and are absolutely central part of the community. Mm-hmm. And there's also very big impacts right up through particularly Camden Town and Primrose Hill ward.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people up there very concerned about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other side, Somers Town, which is actually where I live, between King's Cross and Euston stations, that area has been affected by construction for decades. Mm-hmm. You actually go back to the Euston station that's there now, was built in the 60s. You then go to the British Library, you go to the King's Cross lands, you go even to the building of Regent's High School. And it's an area that's just continually had huge construction, which has a big impact on people's lives, on people's health.
Would you say that we've covered?
I think I was going to ask you about cost of living in the area and high rents, and students just can't really struggle, especially with tuition fees as well. But I mean,
Well, I think in terms of the student housing thing, one of the things that really concerns me is we're seeing a lot of building of specialist student housing, which is usually renting at absolutely astronomical rents. And it's also, I think, being advertised particularly to overseas students on all London's a dangerous place. you'll be secure here. People are fenced behind gates. They're not encouraged to become part of the community. And it's a big issue, particularly for Somers Town, or St Pancras and Somers Town ward, because they're putting in literally thousands of units of student housing, and of course students don't pay council tax, so that's putting real pressure on the services. And what we've got is, the example of one of them, the huge tower block that's going up in the corner of the King's Cross lands. That's actually owned by a private equity company based in a tax haven. We tried to do some research to find out about it, but of course it's all hidden behind the secrecy. You can't find out anything about it. And they're very likely going to make absolutely massive profits out of building something that's really no kind of asset to the community and isn't a great place for students to live either.
I actually heard something, speaking of the community, that they were considering reforming the Camden Lock in the market area.
I mean, there's a real pressure there, as in it's happening right across the whole of Camden, for a kind of gentrification, which tends to be a move away from the opportunities for small independent businesses, people making craft type goods, handmade type goods, and what you find in their place is a whole lot of identikit. Chain stores, big stores that have a whole lot of staff on the minimum wage, often 0 hours contracts or short-term casual contracts, and it's moving towards again an economy that's just really not economically sustainable.
How would you deal with, because something that we see a lot in London is high rises being built, and I think that I think the Heron Tower is currently 90% vacant. Would the Greens, maybe on a local level, but certainly on a national level, particularly with respect to London, how would you combat something like that, where people have constructed these buildings at massive cost, but they're designed to be office space, and really 90% of a building that is absolutely massive, if that were converted into, not necessarily social housing, but even private housing, that would be a benefit to sort of alleviating some of the rent problems and living standard problems that we have?
Well, I think the answer here is really just before you build it, to go back to the planning and really enforce what planning rules that very often exist already. And a good example of this is the old General Post Office sorting office, which is right near the British Museum. One wouldn't say it's any kind of architectural ornament, but it's a basically solid building that you could very easily convert into housing. There's a proposal which I've come out against, and there's a big community campaign against, to turn it into office blocks, even though the planning guidance for this says there should be a lot of housing and a lot of social housing in this site. And what they've done, and it really is almost an insult, is they've put around about 20 flats in this whole giant building, which basically takes up most of a block. They put 20 flats, and they put the flats round on the shady side, above the lane where the deliveries will come in the worst possible bit of the building where you wouldn't conceivably want to live. And it really is an insult in the way it's been done. And the sort of thing we're proposing is, it makes sense on the ground floor not to be housing, it's in a commercial area, but you could set up a really good centre for pop-up businesses, make it a new enterprise centre, or a place where people could be incubating all kinds of new businesses, and then have housing above.
On a local level as well, obviously fossil free is a big campaign at UCL. I was wondering if you've got, obviously the Green Party is known for their environmental policies, what on a local level have you got in store if you get voted?
Okay, well I'll be delighted on your way out to give you my postcode card, which actually supports UCL fossil free and all of the other fossil free campaigns that are going on across the constituency. We're very keen. There's a much broader campaign, which is actually the in terms of supporting a Camden fossil free, so really working with the council as well as the institutions. It's a really exciting area where we're making progress, and we can move on from there. And what I'm going to do at this point is, since someone's coming from the sideline, I'm going to hand out for the cameras some fossil free postcards that you can see.
Cool. Awesome. Cool. So I've got a couple of questions here. So the established parties all have a track record of experienced government ministers, highly qualified personnel that have a great deal of technical experience and expertise. So it's not evident to a lot of people where that same level of experience and expertise is going to come from in the Green Party. So just for the benefit of everyone, what technically skilled and experienced people do you have within the party who could go toe to toe with the establishment, basically, the establishment parties?
Well, first of all, I'd start off with challenging to some degree the premises of the question. In the sense that these are the people who've been running things for the past 3 or 4 decades, say, let's go back that far. They haven't made a great job of it, really, have they? The financial crash is the obvious place to point to, which no one in authority saw coming. We saw Gordon Brown as the Labour Prime Minister just a couple of weeks before giving a speech at Mansion House extolling the virtues of deregulation, light touch regulation or no regulation of the city, how wonderful that was and how that should be a model for everything else in the rest of the country. After which we had global financial crash. So a lot of the existing models, the existing way of doing things have clearly failed. Actually, the status quo, the way we're doing things, really, we cannot continue that way. But in terms of looking at where we draw our expertise from, it's worth saying that the Green Party, we've now got 62,000 members. We're the third largest party in England and Wales. That's a lot of people and a lot of resources. But what we're also drawing on is the broader, what I call the small G green movement. And that means I've already referred to the New Economics Foundation, the Greenpeace, the Friends of the Earth, the Oxfams, the War on Want. Say, for example, our policy on TTIP and our campaigns against TTIP, the proposed EU-US free trade deal. Those things are all informed by the knowledge and experience of all of those people. So we're actually drawing on, a huge range of academic studies. You look at, climate change. We're the people who've been going for the evidence-based policy on climate change, the evidence-based policy on the war on drugs, which has so clearly failed. We're the people who were drawing on all of that expertise, which some of it is in the Green Party, but a lot of it we're prepared to go out and listen to the experts, the people, and hear that advice and act on it.
Brilliant. Cool. So we've also been grilling your manifesto in preparation for this, and some of the changes that you're proposing are very seismic. So a £30 billion getting of tax from
tax avoidance,
people who are tax
yeah.
avoiding. That's 6 times what the Conservatives were proposing to do. Obviously,
well, it would be 6 times what the Conservatives are proposing to do. Really, wouldn't it?
Exactly, it would be. And you're pledging to give 12 billion to the NHS, or increase spending on the NHS by 12 billion, which is more than any other party, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
And there are a range of other things that point to a seismic amount of change in what you're planning to do. So, do you think that this manifesto was written with ideals in mind, or do you think that there's a real pragmatic basis for thinking that these are achievable? Because these shifts are very, very great, and over 5 years to implement them, was it done with a view to we might not get in power, but this is what we're pushing for? Or do you think that if you came into power following the election, you'd be able to pragmatically implement these things?
I think we are the realists, because what's really very clear is actually we cannot continue as we are now. The way we're going, we cannot continue that on an economic basis, on a social basis, or on an environmental basis. And if you look at the economic situation, this government came into power in 2010, for those who can remember back that far, talking about rebalancing our economy, about bringing manufacturing back to Britain, about the fact that we had too much focus on services in the finance sector and we had too much focus on consumer debt. We now have a quote-unquote recovery that's based on consumer debt and money coming from the finance sector, and to add to it, particularly in London, the housing price bubble. What could possibly go wrong? We need to have massive change in our society. We cannot continue as we are. Look at the social side. We launched a couple of days ago a manifesto for disabled people, focusing on how this government has been, the cruel coalition has absolutely hit disabled people really hard. And I was at a hustings in Camden for carers, people who look after disabled and ill people, and the sense of desperation in that room. People going, we're just barely surviving, barely hanging on now. That cannot continue. And then, of course, climate change. I'm sure all of you know about the urgency of that in the Paris talks this year. So we're really at a point where we have to have, big changes. Just tinkering with the edges, around the edges, is not going to do what we need to do.
Related to that, because obviously you mentioned that we are aware of all the negative effects of climate change. How would you go about increasing the awareness? Because I think there are still a lot of people who just think, oh no, it's not actually affecting us immediately.
I think it's quite surprising really when you think about how much influence our right-wing media has, how much we've seen climate skeptic media, that actually the figures have stayed pretty solid, that about 75% of people, the public generally, have accepted human-caused climate change is there and is real and is already happening.
Yeah.
And that's quite an amazing figure given how much propaganda they've been subjected to. So I think that the public has a kind of innate understanding.
Yeah.
The problem has been that they haven't really been presented with plans and policies and things to do. And people kind of get it on an instinctive level that actually, you know, being good about your recycling and changing your light bulbs isn't going to tackle a problem of this sort of scale.
Yeah.
And so because of that, people don't really know what to do because they know that's not enough. And so they're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Obviously we're heading towards a hung parliament, and I was just wondering what would policies that you as the Green Party would want to like really push forward if you're going to be involved in propping up presumably Labour government?
I mean, we will be doing everything we can to stop having a Tory government. Put that on down to start off with. That does potentially leave us, you know, supporting a Labour minority administration. We wouldn't look to coalition.
Yeah.
We'd be looking on a vote-by-vote basis. And within that, what we'd be looking at is obviously anti-austerity measures, the kind of cuts that I was talking about, how the disabled have been hit hugely hard. Single parents have been hit by the cuts to benefits and the cuts to services, and public sector workers have seen their pay, you know, which was never very high to start off with, collapse in real terms. So you're focusing on anti-austerity, trident nuclear weapons, particularly because there's going to be a decision point coming up in the next year or so about whether to start up with a whole new set of nuclear weapons. So there's a real opportunity here to really fight that battle and win. And also, of course, a sensible energy policy, which starts with energy conservation. You know, the best energy you can possibly have, the cheapest and the most environmentally friendly is the energy you don't need to use, you never even think about.
And I just would like to pick up on the anti-austerity again, because obviously in the media everybody says that, oh, we need to cut the budget deficit, we need to have austerity measures everywhere. And your party is obviously against that, and I was just wondering if you could explain why.
Okay, well, first of all, austerity has simply meant making the poor, the disadvantaged and young pay for the errors and fraud of the bankers. So, you know, the reason why we have the deficit problem and the debt problem is because the banks crashed. That's why we're in this situation. And, you know, what we've done is, instead of thinking how do we actually get enough money coming in to meet our essential needs, we've cut back on the essentials, which is really, you know, short term and long term quite stupid, because, you know, if you're not educating the next generations, if you're taking someone who maybe worked in a children's centre, throwing them into unemployment, you haven't got the essential service, they're not paying tax and national insurance anymore, and you're paying the job seekers allowance, you're clearly a lot worse off.
Yeah.
So that's where you're at in that. And, you know, there's been no focus at all on saying, well, where do we collect the money from? And yet we're not saying, you know, obviously ultimately we need to bring the deficit down, but we also need to not demonise debt, because it depends what you borrow for. If you borrow, say, to build a whole lot of council houses, and you've ended right to buy, those council houses are going to be around for decades, maybe longer, that's an asset, and the rent will more than cover what you've borrowed. So you're actually clearly better off borrowing than not borrowing.
Adya, you got some? The last two there.
So, in terms of the other parties, what out of their policies would you like to emulate, or which do you most respect?
Well, I think, you know, it's been clearly identified from that famous hug, among other things, that, you know, there are similarities between the positions of Plaid Cymru and the SNP and the Greens. And there are also very big differences. I mean, the SNP has very different attitudes towards fossil fuel and road building to we do. But obviously they've got, you know, some good policies. They're anti-trident, they're anti-austerity. Those are all good things. So that's where I identify. When you look at the Labour Party, what, you know, I think is really frustrating, and certainly frustrates a lot of Labour Party members, is the fact that they just sort of go a little way down the road to the right policy, but it's not even a halfway house. It's kind of, you know, a couple of little tiny baby steps. And where you need to get to is actually over here. And, you know, things like making the minimum wage a living wage. They're going to offer companies tax breaks. So they're going to offer them reduce the tax take in an attempt to get what should just be standard policy. In terms of the railways, and actually this is a particularly stupid policy, you know, we want to renationalise the railways, bring them back into public hands. They're offering instead to create a public company that's going to bid against the private companies. So you're keeping all of the costs of the fragmentation of the railway system, all of the chaos, and of course there's a risk that this public company bids for the contract and loses, in which case you spent tens of millions of public money.
And it just goes nowhere. Is this the last one?
Yeah, that's our final question.
Okay, well that's good because I probably need to go.
Yeah, we just like you to call the election, like what you think of the outcome.
Well, I think it's worth saying and it's worth stressing to people that this is it's actually not one election. It's more than 600 elections. It's actually individual races in individual seats, and you're not voting for the Prime Minister. You're voting for your local representative, and that means in any individual seat, and some of them it will come down to literally a handful of votes. So it's impossible to call on that basis because you'd actually have to call 600 seats. So what I would say instead is this is really wide open. We're still seeing even today as we're talking, figures show 15% of undecided voters, and maybe even some more people who could still have their mind swayed. So what I would say to everybody is, tactical voting, thinking I'm going to vote for the lesser of two evils, has given us the kind of politics we have now. If voters want something different, a different kind of politics, be brave, be bold, vote for what you believe in, and get real change. Obviously, I'd say vote Green, but above all, I'd say vote for what you believe in, and that way we can all change politics.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's some badges.
Don't want to take all your badges, you've got the all the ones.